The blind leading the blind. Let's have a look at the much heralded OECD report into Scottish education. Well, this has received a lot of media attention and political attention as well, so I thought it'd be good to make a video. I haven't made many videos recently since the election. We'll be back into 2 a week after the election, but we've been working on some longer term projects that you will see come to fruition again in the autumn. Let's have a look at this, and a very important issue. So the OECD has published its report into Scottish education, and the Conservatives say this: damning OECD report slams SNP schools record. Right, that's what the Conservatives say, but it's not true. If you read the report, the Scottish education is not slammed. There are some criticisms, but overall it's pretty congratulatory in tone. But I suppose the Conservatives just think that's their job to present it in that way, even if that isn't actually true. But I'm going to actually look at what the report does say and comment on that. So what do the OECD have to say about Scottish education? Well, how about this? Scotland was among the first education systems to embrace the 21st century learning movement. Okay, what's that? The 21st century learning movement. Never heard of that. Right, quick internet search, what's it all about? Some of the most prominent components of 21st century education: problem solving, critical thinking, collaboration, authentic learning, appropriate use of technologies, and cross-disciplinary teaching. That sounds a bit like the curriculum for excellence. That sounds a bit like the progressive educational mindset epitomised. I mean, problem solving and critical thinking, okay, yeah, fine, but at the expense of knowledge and understanding. Collaboration, in other words, lots of group work, so you're not quite sure who's doing the work. Authentic learning. What does that mean? I've never heard that term before. Again, looked it up. Here it is. Authentic learning is an instructional approach that allows students to explore, discuss, and meaningfully construct concepts and relationships in contexts that involve real-world problems and projects that are relevant to the learner. Okay, that's sort of okay, but what does it mean in some cases? So say in maths you're teaching the quadratic equation formula. They've got to explore it and discuss it and meaningfully construct concepts and relationships in contexts that involve real-world problems. Well, academic study doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you have to learn it, and then you can go on to see where it's applied, because you can't understand how it applies until you first of all know it and understand it. So authentic learning, sort of yes, but it leaves something out as well. The use of technology, again, a bit questionable. I would say cross-disciplinary teaching, that's a bit of an obsession in, well, it has been for decades, but it's seen as very avant-garde. The idea you shouldn't divide the curriculum into separate subjects, that's very old-fashioned and counterproductive. I'm not really sure why. I think that's what works perfectly well and makes it much simpler for teachers, but cross-disciplinary teaching is definitely a fashion. And what's all this for, this 21st century education? To prepare students to make meaningful contributions to the world. Well, that's pretty ambitious, isn't it? So not so much to the family, not to their locale, not to their nation, but to the world, to the whole world. Now you can see the doors are wide open there for all sorts of indoctrination and politicised content. So we get the idea. So the OECD is basically saying, Scotland, curriculum for excellence, we think is brilliant because basically you've done exactly what we told you to do in it. You're just following what we say. So pat on the back, well done. Now listen to this from the report. The current report provides one more opportunity for countries to learn from Scotland's inspiring experience. How about that? And Scotland's inspiring experience. I mean, standards have fallen over the era of the curriculum for excellence, but other countries should be inspired because Scotland has done it the way OECD thinks they should do. So what we've got from the OECD is very much the progressive mentality, group work, exploration, personalised learning, skills, not so much about knowledge, understanding, testing, teaching, etc. Now, even if you think that Scottish education at the moment has got the perfect balance between the progressive and the traditional approaches, even if you believe that, I don't. I believe it's far too far in the progressive direction. But even if you think it's perfect, you should be opposing what the SNP and the OECD, etc., are wanting to do, because they'll always be wanting to take it further in the progressive direction. Whatever the problem is, the solution is move further in the progressive direction, become more and more out of balance. So OECD is saying, well done, you're following our philosophy. Okay, the results are pretty terrible, but we don't care about that. And that's the same attitude you get from Education Scotland. In Education Scotland, you would think would be saying standards are falling. That is our number one priority. What can we do to restore standards in Scottish education? But they're not interested in that. They're interested in equity and social engineering and various political causes, etc., etc. Same with GTCS, General Teaching Council of Scotland. I mean, they will have articles in their magazine that explicitly say measuring maths and English skills, that doesn't really capture what's at the heart of Scottish education. We're really good at developing character qualities and personality. That's what really counts. So we don't really mind if the other standards are declining. The things that can actually be measured are declining. So anyway, so OECD, well, what is it? It's an informal cooperative of rich nations, basically, and a big part of what they do is produce statistics comparing the nations within the grouping. The PISA assessments, you've probably heard of those, where they assess children, 15-year-olds, internationally on reading, science and maths. Then they publish the results in a league table. Scotland's been slipping down that over the last decade since the Curriculum for Excellence was introduced. So the OECD, as far as I'm concerned, is part of the problem. They're pushing this hyper-progressive philosophy of education. So when they come and inspect Scottish education, that's a case of the blind leading the blind. So when we hear debate in the Scottish Parliament, they all accept the presuppositions of the OECD and of the Scottish educational model. So they all work within the same framework. But surely Anne Somerville, just appointed Education Secretary, does anyone really think she spent the last years when she was a Social Security Secretary? I mean, was she spending her weekends reading up on philosophy of education, forming her own personal ideology of education? Unlikely. I mean, John Swinney, before her, I mean, when he was Finance Secretary, was he spending his evenings really thinking through educational issues, ready to implement his own philosophy of education? No, I don't think so. Oliver Mundell for the Conservatives, just put in as education spokesman. I mean, again, has he been thinking through these issues for years? Has he really crystallised his own personal philosophy on these? No. They don't come in with their own vision. They just come in, listen to what people are already saying in the establishment. The Scottish educational establishment, the OECD, they're the same, basically. And so they just blend in with their context and operate within it. So they might try and nitpick here and there, but basically it's within the same agreed overall framework. Now in Scottish politics, it's as though they love doing as they're told by any sort of international body. That's normally the UN. But in this case, it's the OECD. And you could say, does a country really need an external body to come and look at its education system? Well, it might be helpful. They might have some interesting perspectives. But surely, much more important, you should have your own data and you should be assessing it according to your own vision and your own priorities in education. But in Scotland, they can't quite do that, haven't quite got the independent mindedness to be able to do that. So they have to rely very, very heavily on external agencies. So OECD, part of the problem, they just do a pitiful level of debate in the Scottish Parliament, in which, and in the media as well in Scotland, it's assumed that the OECD gives some sort of unbiased, objective assessment. So whatever they say, that's the truth. Where they criticise Scottish education, they must be right. There must be something wrong with Scottish education. Where they say it's great, it must be great. Okay? And actually, that's not the case, because OECD comes with its own flawed perspective. And have you heard anyone else making this point, trying to point this out, apart from my good self? Well, I certainly haven't. Not a hint of that in any media reports I've seen on this topic. So here's another snippet from the OECD report. Again, they're commending Scottish education on achieving this. Scotland successfully developed an education language to support the philosophy of Curriculum for Excellence that made its way into daily discussions of education policy makers, teachers and learners alike, thanks to communication efforts by system leaders. So well done, Scottish education establishment, because you managed to universalise a new set of jargon. As if jargon's ever made any difference to anyone's education system. But it's true. It's true they have reprogrammed the minds of everyone in Scottish education to speak in a new kind of jargon. But to regard that as an achievement, well, I'm not so sure. Right, we've got a nice table here from the OECD report. The grey line shows the plummeting standards in science. The black line shows the declining standards in maths. The blue line shows the standards in reading, which went down very rapidly 2012 to 2015, but have recovered significantly to 2018. That line really does make me wonder about their assessment procedures. I mean, can it really fluctuate that wildly? I'm not so sure. But still, overall, it's lower in 2018 than it was in 2012. Right, this decline in standards, is that a major theme in the OECD report? No. No, not at all. I mean, they're just like Scottish educationalists. They're not really bothered about that. They've got much more important things to look at. For example, equity. Oh, here we go again. We never stop hearing about it in political debate in Scotland about education. And lo and behold, that's exactly what the OECD are talking about as well. So let's read from the report. Students' socio-economic status has a relatively small impact on their performance in Scotland compared to other OECD countries and economies. So this relates to what they call in Scotland the poverty-related attainment gap, because pupils from schools in wealthier areas perform better than pupils in schools in less well-off areas. But this OECD report is saying that from what they can measure, the impact of socio-economic status on student attainment is actually pretty small in Scotland compared to other wealthier, in general, fairly wealthy countries. So they say it doesn't look like it's a particular problem in Scotland, yet in Scotland it is the number one priority. It's all the SNP ever talk about. And the opposition parties as well, they keep banging on about it again and again and again, yet the OECD is saying it isn't a particular problem in Scotland. In fact, Scotland is actually, there's relatively little connection between wealth and educational attainment. Anyway, let's carry on. Reading from the report. In 2018, the socio-economic status, as measured by the PISA Index of Economic, Social and Cultural Status, explained only 8.6% of the difference in performance between students from the most and least advantaged backgrounds in Scotland. Right, now I've looked at that sentence very carefully. 8.6% of the difference accounted by economic, social, cultural status. Now that sentence makes it sound like only 8.6% of the difference between the higher economic status, the lower economic status ones was actually to do with that status. But I think that sentence is just wrong. I've looked into it really carefully, at all the other documentation, to see if they did have some complex means of trying to isolate what difference the economic, social and cultural status did actually make. But it's not that. It is just, out of all the difference between students, only 8.6% of it can be accounted for, potentially, as to do with economic, social and cultural status, and family background basically. This means that students' socio-economic status had a smaller impact on their performance in Scotland than on average across the OECD, where it explained 12% of the difference in performance. It then said similar situation in maths and in science, that the economic, social and cultural status of pupils has less effect in Scotland than it does in other countries, which might make you think this shows that this isn't a particular problem in Scotland. Anyway, continuing from other OECD documentation. Equality of opportunity means that performance should not depend on personal circumstances that stem from the randomness of birth, but to individual effort. Right, what do you make of that then? Performance should not depend on personal circumstance that stem from the randomness of birth, but it all should be down to individual effort. Right, where does the randomness of birth come into this? Well, let's face the facts. An important part of the randomness of birth is sort of IQ, ability to learn, ability to excel in academic study. Okay, and that is to do with the randomness of birth. So if they're claiming they're wanting to eliminate that and make it so that educational outcome solely depends on individual effort, well, that's a fool's errand. I mean, it can't be done. It's unrealistic. It's just denying the facts of life, the facts of nature, the facts of genetics, etc. Anyway, that's their vision, the same as it is for the whole Scottish educational establishment. Right, so look into the OECD again. The weaker the relationship, the more a school system is able to compensate for unfavourable learning environments outside of school, and thus may be considered to be more equitable. Okay, so the less relationship there is between poverty and attainment, roughly speaking, then the more equitable it is. Previous results from PISA suggest that equity in education may be related to whether or not students are tracked into different streams based on prior performance. Comprehensive education systems, where all students follow a similar path through education, regardless of their academic performance, often perform better and are more equitable than education systems that rely on horizontal stratification. So what they're basically saying is no streaming and no setting. You've got to have mixed ability groups in every subject at every level. Now, as a former maths teacher, I can say that that's just nuts. It's just totally unrealistic. And the restriction that places on what you're able to do with a more able set is enormous. So in terms of enhancing equity, well, I'm sure it does. Because the more able students will not be able to progress at the pace they would otherwise be able to do. For the less able as well, they won't have the sort of targeted support that they need. If you've got a class with quite a narrow ability range, you can target the whole class teaching to try and cover that range. Okay, there'll be individuals needing something slightly different, but you can deal with them as one, and that's much more efficient and much more effective. But the real reason PISA, OECD, etc. don't like this is basically it reflects a political philosophy. They're anti-meritocratic. Everyone should be equal. Everyone should get very similar results, if not the same results. So you want to put everyone the same. To actually separate people according to ability is against their philosophy. So I'm sure, they've got lots of research backing it up. Yeah. And I'm sure there'll be people on the other side of the argument with lots of research backing that up as well. But I'm very sceptical of their view. But what this means is that in Scottish education, any sort of setting and streaming is going to go out of the window. I think it largely has in a lot of schools in any case, but I think that will be completed. That will happen in independent schools as well, as the inspectors come in and basically say to the schools, you're not doing this right. The schools might say, it works really well. Look at our exam results. They're absolutely brilliant. We get great results for the more able, for the less able. We get great results for those in the middle. We're really happy with how it works. And Education Scotland would say, don't care. We think you should do it this way because that's right. So do it our way. And their standards will decline further. Right, back to the OECD. From the beginning, parents of higher socioeconomic status are more likely to provide their children with the financial support and home resources for individual learning. They're more likely to have higher levels of education. They're also more likely to provide a more stimulating home environment to promote cognitive development. Right, there's probably a little bit of truth in that, but the science shows that the impact of nurture on academic ability is somewhere in the region of like 0 to 10% of the variation. So pretty insignificant. Much more important are genetics and randomness. So out of a child's academic ability, about half of it can be accounted for by what's passed down in the genes from their parents, and about half of it completely random. Another important factor in it that they neglect is family structure. For example, fatherlessness has a very negative impact on educational attainment, but they don't fit the narrative, so they miss theirs out and try and focus on rich parents buying them more puzzles to do. Does anyone seriously think that has a major impact on academic attainment? I really don't think it does. Just going back to this streaming idea, reading other aspects of the report, which I won't go through in detail, I would say as well, independent schools in Scotland, you're doomed. Because the OECD basically says you shouldn't exist. And if the OECD says it, then that's regarded as like the gospel truth. So that's what the government will be moving towards. And at the point where they think it's politically feasible, then you're for the chop. Okay, just being realistic, you need to know that. But that's what's coming. So continuing on the equity theme, the OECD report looks at exam results in Scotland. And it says at level 4, that's national 4 level, 15-year-olds. These are the exams where they're marked in school. You can keep resitting them and as many times as you like. If the teacher's so inclined, they can sort of give you a bit of a hand while you're doing the test, etc. Right, with those ones, 98.8% of students from the least deprived areas attained 1 pass or more, 92.1% from the most deprived areas. So comparing the extremes, basically. So a gap of, what's that, 6.7% between them. So quite a small gap when they're not really assessed properly by an objective standard. They've got this quite soft, teacher-administered, wide open to corruption, take it as many times as you like system. So that makes the attainment gap very narrow. Moving on to National 5, which is slightly more rigorous, relatively speaking. 94.6% of students from the least deprived areas attained 1 or more passes, 74.4% from the most deprived areas. So the attainment gap there goes up to 20%. Pretty dramatic increase. Then we go up to level 6, so we're talking higher, advanced higher. 79.3% of students from the least deprived areas attained 1 pass or more, 43.5% from those from the most deprived areas. So the attainment gap goes up to 35%. So if your mission is to close the attainment gap, well, it seems like the more rigorous and objective the testing, the bigger the attainment gap. So obviously the National 4 model, where it's all a bit woolly and wide open to corruption, seems to be the way forward. We'll come back to that later and see what the OECD is recommending. Right, another issue that they major on is knowledge. Now listen to some of these comments about the curriculum for excellence. In the absence of clarification on what is expected in terms of knowledge as part of the learning process, the role of knowledge appears somewhat fragmented and left to interpretation at the school level, although it is an essential component of learning in the Curriculum for Excellence framework. In the overview of attributes and capabilities, knowledge is only referred to indirectly in the successful learner capacities attributes as literacy and numeracy skills, and in the responsible citizen capacity, but without further detail in the experiences and outcomes about what knowledge is referring to. Now that is a pretty damning criticism. So you've got a curriculum that's not really specifying what knowledge is involved in it. So let's carry on. Students interviewed spoke about the challenges they faced in making the transition from the BGE, the broad general education, that's up to age 15, into senior phase, when they had not consolidated the basic knowledge required for deeper learning underpinning the senior phase. It may be that the overall place given to knowledge in the Curriculum for Excellence is too implicit, and that the overall representation of capacities creates a misleading impression that a strong knowledge base is no longer a priority. Right, that's what I've said, that's what other people have said as well about the Curriculum for Excellence, that it devalues knowledge, because knowledge is a bit old-fashioned. The idea that the teacher's got some knowledge and they want to impart it to the pupils, a lot of teachers in Scotland would be horrified at so antiquated a concept. They'd say, don't you realise this is the 21st century? Education is not about pouring knowledge into students so that they gain the knowledge that you had previously. For a start, they'd say it's very arrogant of teachers to think that they've got knowledge that the students haven't. That's the way an awful lot of people think. So carrying on in the report, the conceptualization of knowledge is difficult, particularly for education systems attempting to move away from traditional content-dominated curricula. Well, yeah, of course it is. If you decide that the current fashion in curriculum design is to move away from traditional content-dominated curricula, then obviously the danger is that you're going to downplay content. People are not really going to know what you're supposed to know at the end of it, and that's what's happened with the Curriculum for Excellence. So what we've got here is the Curriculum for Excellence has been criticised for being light on knowledge, unclear about what knowledge is required. And that criticism is coming from the OECD, who is itself pretty extreme in its progressive ideology. So that's like if you got criticised by the Greens and they said the measures you're taking to tackle climate change are just going too far, you're being too rigorous about it. You think, oh wow, if the Greens are saying that, it must be really, really crazy. Or let's say Stonewall said, you know these pride celebrations you're having in your office, we think they're a bit over the top. We think you could just tone it down a bit. If Stonewall are saying that, wow, they must be pretty wild. And yet the OECD is saying that it's light, it's weak on knowledge. So if the OECD is saying it, it must be pretty bad. Right, let's carry on. What else has the report got to say? Existing accountability mechanisms. Sorry, let's go back a bit. Let's just go back to the Conservatives who are saying this report slams the Scottish education system. Yeah, that bit is very, very critical. But let's not forget that the Scottish Conservative Party supported the curriculum for excellence through every stage of its development. So it was clear to anyone who had any breadth of understanding of these issues that this is what it was going to be like. This is the direction it was going in. And the Conservatives agreed with it, supported it every step of the way. And now that the results are clear, they're now trying to say, oh yes, it's very bad, or it should never have been like that. But they're entirely responsible for it, along with all the other parties in the Scottish Parliament. So back to the OECD. Existing accountability mechanisms focus on narrower outcomes than suggested in Curriculum for Excellence's vision, which creates incentives for senior phase students and secondary schools to hold on to traditional teaching, learning and assessment practices that do not align with the practices and pedagogy relevant to Curriculum for Excellence. So they're now talking about the senior phase where you specialise more, so not the broad general education, the last 3 years, where it's National 5 Highers, Advanced Highers. So what they're saying is, before that phase, it's a bit light on knowledge, but then they're saying within that phase, well, it's a bit old-fashioned in terms of traditional learning and teaching and assessment practices that don't align with the practices and pedagogy relevant to the Curriculum for Excellence. Basically, what's been happening for years is the Curriculum for Excellence has just been a woolly mess. But the Scottish Qualifications Authority has been saving the day by still producing reasonably academically rigorous and objective tests. And that has rescued the Scottish education system to some degree at the senior end. But what the OECD is saying is they're saying that these high quality assessments and these clear academic curricula syllabuses presented by the Scottish Qualifications Authority, they're actually a problem. They're old fashioned, and in order to get in line with the Curriculum for Excellence, they need to ditch a lot of that and go for the same sort of mushy, anything goes, open to corruption type assessment that you have at National 4 level. So that's what the OECD is saying. Let's carry on. It should consider reviewing the coherence of Curriculum for Excellence enactment for learners aged 15 to 18 as the qualifications focus the attention on traditional exam and memory-based assessment. Now, they're talking about knowledge earlier on, saying it was light on knowledge. Memory-based. Isn't that the same as saying involving knowledge? There's some things you have to know and demonstrate that you know, and therefore you have to store them in your memory. Okay? But they're saying memory-based assessment is somehow a bad thing. So it doesn't matter what you can remember. You can always just look it up. Well, it does matter what you can remember, because your understanding and your ability to respond to new situations often relies on knowledge that's permanently in your memory. But they want to move away from that. So they're saying these traditional memory-based assessments limit the wider purpose and scope of Curriculum for Excellence. Scotland may also reflect on the range of learning activities that appear narrow, with more traditional instructional patterns and an over-reliance on course and disciplinary knowledge coverage. Okay? So there's too much reliance on covering the syllabus and learning and gaining knowledge within your subject. They're saying there's too much of that, we've got to get away from it, because that's traditional and they're hyper progressive. I mean, how wrong can they be? So, I mean, what's going to happen to the poor old Scottish Qualifications Authority, who've been the last outpost of any sort of intellectual rigour in the Scottish educational system? Well, they're in the firing line, aren't they? By the look of it. Right, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a unique opportunity to explore different alternatives to student assessment, which can be considered in the future in relation to this gap. More emphasis on flexible, formative and continuous assessment components than is currently the case. Current emphasis is strong on all-in-one final summative exam events, even if other components exist. So basically OECD is saying the same as the Green Party has been saying. The Green Party has been saying, ditch exams, we'd rather have teachers making it up, and not really as objective, not as secure, more open to all sorts of foul play, but that would be the best way because it closes the attainment gap and it's more progressive, and OECD is right behind the Greens. Approaches allowing for fuller alignment with 21st century curricula include, again, as if that just automatically means it's the right thing to do. It aligns with fashion, they're saying. So that sentence effectively says, in order to be keeping up with fashion, this is what you should do. A more central role for continuous teacher assessment during the course, based on classwork and school-based tests. Right, problems with those. If the teacher marks it, then every teacher wants their class to do well. Every school wants their pupils to do well. Some teachers will be a bit more generous in their marking than others. Some teachers will give a bit more of a clue during the test. Some teachers will teach a bit more directly to the test. I mean, you'll get some who will basically write the answers on the board beforehand and then wipe them off and say, right, let's do the test now before you forget. And various things in between. Based on classwork, people will help each other. If it's done at home, parents will help, etc. There's not security there. And that will tend to benefit pupils from these higher income groups as well in general. Right, so they're saying teacher set and marked work that is externally moderated by other teachers. Okay, the teacher sets and marks it is open to the same problems. The teacher can interfere in that process in various ways. Externally marked projects and extended essays, again, wide open to cheating because pupils can get help with them from their own teachers, from other teachers, from family members, tutors, whoever else. So again, that will advantage certain pupils, disadvantage others. Oral and practical presentations. Okay, fine. Okay, they're quite difficult to examine. I think oral exams are normally fine. If you're there with an external examiner, there's no problem with that. If it's with your teacher or a teacher within the school, then maintaining standards, consistent standards, is going to be very difficult. And at one point, the report says that the Scottish exam system is a bit 19th century. So the OECD and the Green Party are completely on the same wavelength. So what's happening to the poor old SQA? Well, it's been scrapped. It's just bizarre. It's been shut down. So what was their crime? The Scottish Qualifications Authority trying to maintain a rigorous objective examination and qualification system through the coronavirus pandemic. That's what they tried to do. I won't retell that story again, but basically that's resulted in them getting the chop. So instead we're going to go towards a 21st century education approach in assessment, which will devalue Scottish qualifications and will end up with the universities starting to set their own exams because they don't trust the official exam system. Well, let's move on to a few other things from the report. Students report more often being exposed to bullying in Scotland than on average across OECD countries. Right, why would that be? Scottish young people, children, are they a bit meaner than in other countries? I don't really think so. Might it be because the schools in Scotland are quite weak on discipline? They've got this restorative approach rather than punishing. So when there is a bully, someone who's really making other people's life a misery, they're just allowed to get away with it for too long. Well, that might well be part of the picture there. Right, more on discipline. The disciplinary climate in regular classes is similar in Scotland to the average climate across OECD countries. The large majority of students declare that situations that are unconducive to learning occur never or hardly ever, or in some lessons only. Now, they're making that sound like discipline's good. A large majority of students declare that situations are unconducive to learning occur in some lessons only. In other words, they're saying it's not every lesson that's disrupted. It's only in some of them. And they're saying this is a sign that discipline is good. Right, well, I'm not so sure. Right, next thing. Competition between students seems to be slightly more common in Scotland than cooperation. So they asked questions basically of whether they cooperate or compete with other students. In Scotland, it turned out that slightly more than the OECD average said that they competed with other students, maybe slightly less said they collaborated. And of course, you guessed it, as far as the OECD is concerned, collaboration is good, competition is bad. So that's something that Scotland needs to work on. So they need to remove competitive activities from schools. Again, completely disagree with that philosophy. But is anyone in the Scottish Government going to disagree with this? Is anyone in the Scottish educational establishment going to just point blank stand up and say, no, OECD, you're wrong on this one? You're wrong. No. So Scottish education will be pulled further out of balance, away from healthy and productive competition. Right, student well-being. Students in Scotland report slightly lower life satisfaction than the OECD average and more prevalent fear of failure than average. Now, that fear of failure, I find that fascinating. I mean, is the Scottish education system some sort of high-pressure hothouse? I mean, it's anything but. It's at the other end of the spectrum. I think expectations are low, pressure's quite low. If pupils don't do things or if they don't achieve a standard, I mean, what happens? Generally, not very much. So I would suggest this is more that the education system is producing a degree of fragility or lack of resilience in pupils rather than pressure is excessive. Student well-being at age 15 shows a mixed picture, with higher levels than OECD average in bullying, in competition and in anxiety, and lower student well-being. It's important to note that students at age 16 take their national exams, which are high stakes in terms of their next educational steps. In other words, students in Scotland are a bit miserable, a bit pressurised, they say, and OECD is trying to suggest that's because they have to do exams. So exams make upset pupils and it's too much pressure for them, affects their mental health or whatever. So OECD is basically saying just scrap the exams in order to keep the pupils happier. Again, bang on message with the Scottish Green Party. Bang on message. So if the Greens want it, it happens in Scotland. If the OECD wants it, it happens. So as I've been saying for a long time now, I'm not sure there's ever going to be another exam in Scotland, or certainly at National 5 level. Well, let's see how it comes out. But over the next few years, a lot of exams, I think, are going to become a thing of the past. Right, moving on. So 15-year-olds' levels in global competencies. I spoke about this a couple of years ago in a video, so it's time for an update. PISA's new global competence module aims to capture the capacity of 15-year-olds to examine local, global and intercultural issues, to understand and appreciate the perspectives and worldviews of others, to engage in open, appropriate and effective interactions with people from different cultures, and to act for collective well-being and sustainable development. What they're meaning there is they want to inculcate in the 15-year-olds a sort of globalist, multiculturalist, liberal, secular, progressive, left-leaning sort of worldview. And Scotland decided a couple of years ago to enter this programme, and the students have been assessed and the results are now out. So how did Scotland do? Well, Scotland ranked among the top performing countries in global competence. It scored higher than its expected outcomes based on its average results in reading, maths and science. Scotland was the 4th top performing country. So it's saying, despite the decline in reading, maths and science, Scotland has come in as absolutely top level in this sort of liberal indoctrination aspect of the assessments. Now, the person at OECD who is responsible for these global competency assessments, he said if we'd have had this scheme in place earlier, the Brexit vote might never have happened. In other words, we're totally open to the fact that this is about changing pupils' political outlook. So let's have a quick look at some of the questions that are in this global competency assessment. So pupils in Scotland, a sample of them, 15-year-olds, had to answer these questions, and Scotland was put in a league table according to their answers. So the right and wrong answers to these. How informed are you about the following topics? Climate change and global warming. So it's not that you have to actually know anything about it. You just have to say whether you think you know about it or not. So the top one is, I am familiar with this and I would be able to explain it well. And if your pupils think they can explain it well, if Scottish pupils can't explain that, I really don't know what they can explain, because it seems like that's sort of half the curriculum is about climate change. Equality between men and women in different parts of the world. Okay, pupils have to be familiar with that issue. I believe there are two sides to every question, and try to look at them both. And you just have to rate yourself on that scale. So in Scotland, it seems pupils tended to rate themselves a bit higher. I would suggest the whole Scottish education system belies that principle entirely and operates as though there's one true truth. There's only one side of an argument worth considering, so that's what gets taught to the pupils. But anyway, that's a question from this. How about this for a question? I can deal with unusual situations. What would you say for that? Can you deal with unusual situations? You'd obviously say, well, it depends what they are, doesn't it? I mean, what a stupid question. But anyway, yes, that's very much like me. If you say that, then you're getting the highest grades, and your country's likely to come out higher up in the league table. Imagine you're talking in your native language to people whose native language is different from yours. What would you do? One of the things is, I explain things very carefully. And you say you strongly agree or whatever. So you rate yourself at how good you are at speaking to people who don't speak your language very well. Again, this is going in there alongside maths, science, reading, and this as well. Are you involved in the following activities? I choose certain products for ethical or environmental reasons, even if they are a bit more expensive. And the correct answer, obviously, the correct answer is yes. So if you're a teacher in Scotland, your mission, I assume, is to educate pupils in global competence, so-called. It's not global competence, it's political indoctrination. And so you've got to get them to give the right answer. So it would seem, if this is the curriculum, it would seem perfectly justified to spend a lesson finding products to boycott. Because if you've done that, you get the mark. You've done well in the exam if you've boycotted products. I sign out environmental or social petitions online. Okay, teacher, what are you going to do? Your pupils are, this is the curriculum. They're supposed to have signed environmental or social petitions online. So next lesson, let's just do it. Let's go to the computers, get them all to log on to some petitions and sign a few. Then we've got it done. They'll all say yes, and Scotland will come out top of the league table. I boycott products and companies for political, ethical or environmental reasons. I participate in activities promoting equality between men and women. Participate in activities promoting equality between men and women. Okay, school, what are you going to do about that one? Well, you better have sort of feminism day, hadn't you? Then they'll all be able to tick that box. And that is indeed what lots of schools do. Right, more questions. How well does each of the following statements describe you? I'm interested in finding about the traditions of other cultures. Am I interested in finding out about the traditions of other cultures? Yeah, a bit. Yeah, sort of. It's not a main interest of mine. I'm more interested in some other things, but that's not good enough. The more interested you are, the better you are, and the better your country is doing in terms of global competence according to PISA. Do you have contact with people from other countries in your family? So are there people from other countries in your family? Obviously, if the answer is yes, then your country is doing better. It's just bizarre, isn't it? I respect the values of people from different cultures. Well, yeah, sort of. Debatable. Maybe not all of them. But there's no room for debate in that. The more you respect the values of people from other countries, then the better you're doing and the higher up the league table we get. How about this one? I think of myself as a citizen of the world. So remember in Scotland, maths, science, that's declining pretty dramatically. But when it comes to thinking of themselves as citizens of the world, Scottish pupils are among the best in the world. Think of myself as a citizen of the world. What does it even mean? It's right to boycott companies that are known to provide poor workplace conditions for their employees. Right, maybe, in some circumstances. Maybe if you bankrupt the company, maybe the people will be in an even worse situation, so that's a bit debatable, but no room for debate. If you strongly agree, then your country will be on the way up the league table. Immigrants who live in a country for several years should have the opportunity to vote in elections. Debatable. Maybe you should say it's when people become a citizen they get to vote in elections. So two sides to the argument there. Not in this. The more strongly you agree, the more points you get, and the better your country is doing. Immigrants should have all the same rights that everyone else in the country has. Well, again, citizens have all the same rights, and it's up to nations to decide what process there is to gain citizenship. So a bit of a debate to have there. Not on this though. The more strongly you agree with that, the more points you score. Right, so that's the global competence indoctrination element, in which Scotland has excelled. To be honest, if Scotland wasn't right up there at the sharp end, goodness knows who would be. Because can any country really put much more into indoctrinating pupils in this sort of direction than Scotland does? It's hard to imagine, and the results bear it out. So that's what's going on there. One last little thing for the OECD. They said there's a shortage of valid and reliable evaluation data on student outcomes at the system level. In other words, Scotland is a bit of a data desert. Scottish education is a bit of a data desert. We haven't got long-term data showing the changes in standards at different stages through primary school, secondary school, and different parts of the country, different areas, etc. Now, this is something the SNP has tried to address, quite rightly, credit where it's due. And part of the way they tried to address that was introducing little tests in primary one. This was about 2 years ago, I think. So they came up with these very simple little online tests where pupils counted the apples or whatever. And if you got questions wrong, it didn't go on to harder questions. It gave you easier questions. But if you kept getting them right, it would give you slightly harder ones. So it was designed so it wouldn't be very stressful for any of the little kiddies sitting counting the apples or saying what colour the dog was or whatever. Now, when the SNP tried to introduce these, the other parties, teaching unions, lots of teachers, they made it sound like child abuse. That, the poor children were having their childhood stolen from them. It was just traumatizing them, having to sit at the computer for half an hour counting apples. So I think basically the SNP dropped it, facing opposition from, I believe, every other party in the Scottish Parliament. So the OECD is saying that this needs to happen. So I think the SNP will just feel it's too politically contentious to actually try and gather realistic, useful, long-term data within Scottish education. So the SNP is basically not prepared to be unpopular in order to do what's necessary in the education system. So there we have it. There's the OECD report. The big picture, what's the main takeaway? The main takeaway point is the OECD is not neutral. They're biased. They're biased in exactly the same way as the rest of the Scottish educational system. So the OECD's report just basically endorses where we already are with Scottish education and overall pushes it further in the wrong direction. So all of the debate and discussion about it that assumes that the OECD is some sort of neutral, objective arbiter and judge, well, it's really missing the other side of the argument. How often do we say that in Scottish politics? Too often. But anyway, there's a quick update on the Scottish education debate. Right, do subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.